The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 20-year-old Ethan Parker stood at the Family Feud podium with the distant expression of someone who existed in a constant state of disconnection from their own life, his eyes holding the peculiar emptiness that comes from watching yourself move through the world as if you were observing a stranger, as if your own experiences were happening to someone else in a movie you couldn't turn off. When Steve Harvey asked about times when you feel like nothing is real, Ethan's response, delivered with the flat honesty of someone who had learned that feeling like a ghost in your own life is a form of suffering that few people understand, would reveal the isolating reality of living with depersonalization disorder in a world that demands constant presence and engagement. Every moment of every day, Ethan had said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years spent feeling like he was watching his life happen from outside his own body. I feel like I'm not real. Like I'm watching someone else live my life, like nothing I experience is actually happening to me. The studio had fallen into a puzzled silence as everyone present tried to understand what it meant to feel constantly disconnected from your own existence, to live in a state where even your most intimate experiences feel like they're happening to someone else, and where the fundamental sense of being present in your own life has somehow been severed or damaged beyond easy repair. Ethan Parker had first experienced depersonalization during a panic attack in his senior year of high school, but what had started as a temporary symptom of anxiety had evolved into a chronic condition that had fundamentally altered his relationship with reality, consciousness, and his own sense of self. For 3 years, he had been living in a state of constant dissociation, where he felt like an observer of his own life rather than an active participant in his experiences. Depersonalization disorder is a condition characterized by persistent or recurrent feelings of detachment from one's own mental processes or body, as if one were observing oneself from outside or in a dream. People with this condition often describe feeling like they're watching themselves in a movie, feeling emotionally numb or disconnected from their own thoughts and feelings, and experiencing their surroundings as unreal, dreamlike, or distorted. The onset of Ethan's depersonalization had been sudden and terrifying. During what had seemed like a routine presentation in his AP psychology class, he had experienced an intense panic attack that had left him feeling like he had somehow stepped outside of his own body and was watching himself struggle to breathe and think clearly. But unlike typical panic attacks that resolve within minutes or hours, the feeling of disconnection had persisted long after his anxiety had subsided. In the days and weeks following that initial incident, Ethan had found himself unable to shake the sensation that he wasn't fully present in his own life. He had continued attending classes, socializing with friends, and participating in normal activities, but everything had felt muted, distant, and somehow artificial, as if he were going through the motions of living without actually experiencing life itself. The most disturbing aspect of Ethan's condition had been the way it affected his emotional connections to people and experiences that had previously been meaningful to him. He had found himself unable to feel genuine joy, sadness, excitement, or affection, even during events that should have been emotionally significant. Graduation from high school, acceptance to college, relationships with friends and family members. All of these experiences had felt flat and disconnected, as if he were observing them happen to someone else rather than living them himself. Ethan had initially assumed that his symptoms were temporary, perhaps related to stress or the major life transitions of late adolescence. He had hoped that starting college would provide new stimulation and engagement that might help him feel more present and connected to his experiences. But the move to university had actually intensified his symptoms, as the new environment and social pressures had made his sense of disconnection even more pronounced and problematic. The academic demands of college had been particularly challenging for someone experiencing chronic depersonalization. Ethan had found it difficult to concentrate during lectures because he felt like he wasn't really there, had struggled to retain information because everything felt dreamlike and unreal, and had experienced significant anxiety about his inability to engage with his coursework in the focused way that academic success required. Social relationships had become increasingly difficult as Ethan's condition had persisted. Friends and roommates had begun noticing that he seemed distant, emotionally unavailable, and somehow not all there. But Ethan had found it impossible to explain what he was experiencing in ways that others could understand. When he had tried to describe feeling like he wasn't real or wasn't fully present, people had often responded with confusion, dismissal, or suggestions that he just needed to snap out of it or focus more on the present moment. The isolation that came with having a condition that was difficult to explain or understand had been profound and demoralizing. Ethan had felt like he was living behind glass, able to see and interact with the world but unable to truly touch or be touched by the experiences and relationships that surrounded him. Even positive experiences, achievements, celebrations, moments of beauty or connection had felt hollow and meaningless because of his inability to fully experience them. Ethan's family had struggled to understand what he was going through and how to help him. His parents, David and Sarah Parker, had been supportive but confused, initially attributing his symptoms to stress, depression, or normal adjustment difficulties associated with starting college. When Ethan had tried to explain that his problem wasn't sadness or anxiety, but rather a fundamental disconnection from reality itself, they had found it difficult to comprehend what that meant or how it could be addressed. The family had sought help from various mental health professionals, but finding appropriate treatment for depersonalization disorder had proved challenging. Many therapists were unfamiliar with the condition, and those who did understand it had explained that treatment options were limited and often focused on managing symptoms rather than achieving complete resolution of the disconnection. Ethan had tried various medications, therapy approaches, and lifestyle changes in an attempt to reconnect with his sense of self and reality, but progress had been slow and inconsistent. Some days had been better than others, but he had never been able to achieve the sustained sense of presence and connection that he remembered from before his symptoms had begun. The most frightening aspect of Ethan's condition had been the fear that he might never feel real or present again, that he might spend the rest of his life feeling like a ghost in his own existence. He had researched the condition extensively and had learned that while some people recovered completely, others experienced chronic symptoms that required long-term management and adaptation. The existential questions raised by his condition had been overwhelming and isolating. Ethan had found himself questioning the nature of consciousness, reality, and identity in ways that felt both philosophically interesting and personally terrifying. If he couldn't feel like himself, if his experiences didn't feel real, if he couldn't connect emotionally with his own life, what did that mean about who he was and whether his existence had meaning or value? The Family Feud application had been submitted by Sarah Parker, who had hoped that participating in a fun, engaging activity might help Ethan feel more present and connected to positive experiences. She had thought that the energy and excitement of television production might provide the kind of stimulation that could help break through his emotional numbness and disconnection. During the pre-show preparations, Ethan had participated mechanically, going through the required motions but clearly experiencing everything from a distance. The production team had noticed that he seemed unusually detached and unresponsive compared to typical contestants, but they had attributed this to nervousness or shyness rather than understanding the neurological condition that was affecting his ability to engage with the experience. The game had been proceeding with Ethan providing appropriate responses when necessary, but showing little enthusiasm or emotional engagement with the competitive aspects of the show. The Parker family was playing against the Rodriguez family from Texas, and while both sides had been participating energetically, there was something hollow about Ethan's involvement that suggested he was present physically but absent emotionally. But when it came time for the category Times When You Feel Like Nothing Is Real, and it was Ethan's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the core of his daily experience and the fundamental challenge that had been defining his existence for 3 years. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Ethan's distant expression and emotional flatness had made Steve more attentive and concerned than usual. "All right, Ethan," Steve had said gently, "times when you feel like nothing is real. What comes to mind?" Ethan had looked at Steve with eyes that seemed to be seeing him from a great distance, then answered with the matter-of-fact honesty that comes from someone who has lost the energy to pretend that their experience is normal. "Every moment of every day," Ethan had said, his words carrying 3 years of feeling like a stranger in his own life. "I feel like I'm not real, like I'm watching someone else live my life, like nothing I experience is actually happening to me." The studio had become very quiet as everyone present tried to process what Ethan had shared and the implications of living in a constant state of disconnection from reality and self. Steve had paused, clearly recognizing that this young man was describing something far more serious than typical feelings of confusion or uncertainty. "Ethan," Steve had said with obvious concern, "that sounds like it would be incredibly difficult to live with. How long have you been feeling this way?" 3 years, Ethan had replied flatly. "Since I was 17. I had a panic attack during a class presentation, and afterward I never felt like I came back into my body. I've been watching my life happen from the outside ever since." The studio audience had listened with growing understanding and empathy as they began to comprehend the isolating reality of living with a condition that affects the most basic sense of being present in one's own existence. "Can you help me understand what that feels like, day to day?" Steve had asked with genuine curiosity and compassion. Everything feels like it's happening in a dream, Ethan had explained. I can see and hear and interact with people, but it doesn't feel real. It's like watching a movie of someone else's life. I know intellectually that I'm here, that this is my body, that these are my experiences, but I can't feel it. I can't connect to any of it emotionally. Steve had looked at David and Sarah Parker, who were clearly struggling with watching their son describe his ongoing suffering. Mr. and Mrs. Parker, Steve had said, how has this affected your family? We've tried everything, Sarah had said through tears. Doctors, therapists, medications. We want to help him, but we don't really understand what he's going through or how to reach him. David had nodded, his voice thick with emotion. It's like our son is there but not there, David had said. He looks like Ethan, he sounds like Ethan, but something essential is missing. It breaks our hearts. Steve had looked at Ethan with deep respect for his courage in sharing something so personal and difficult to explain. Ethan, Steve had said, what you're describing is called depersonalization disorder, and it's a real medical condition. You're not making it up, you're not crazy, and you're not alone. There are other people who understand exactly what you're experiencing. Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, understanding that this moment required both validation of Ethan's condition and affirmation of his fundamental humanity and worth. Ethan, Steve had said, placing the jacket around his shoulders, this jacket represents something very important today. It represents the understanding that you are real, your feelings are real, your struggle is real, and your life has meaning even when it doesn't feel that way to you. Ethan had pulled the jacket closer, and for the first time during the entire taping, his expression had shown a flicker of something that might have been genuine emotion. Steve had turned to address the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve had announced, Ethan Parker is dealing with a condition that affects his ability to feel present in his own life, but that doesn't make him any less real or any less valuable as a human being. He's showing incredible courage by being here and by sharing his experience with us. The game had resumed with increased understanding and support from everyone present as the audience and production team recognized that they were witnessing someone who was fighting to feel connected to his own existence, despite overwhelming neurological obstacles. When Steve had asked the final question about things that give you hope, Ethan had answered, moments when I almost feel like myself again. The episode aired 5 months later and became an important educational tool for raising awareness about depersonalization disorder and other dissociative conditions. Mental health organizations used Ethan's story to help people understand these conditions and to encourage others who might be experiencing similar symptoms to seek appropriate help. Ethan had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when someone had validated his reality and affirmed his worth despite his struggle with feeling real. More importantly, the exposure his story received had connected him with specialists who understood his condition and with other people who shared similar experiences. The jacket represented his understanding that his struggle to feel present didn't diminish his value as a person, that seeking help for neurological conditions was a sign of strength rather than weakness, and that human connection and understanding were possible even when emotional connection felt impossible. Because that's what courage looks like when it faces the most fundamental questions about reality and consciousness. That's what hope sounds like when it persists despite feeling disconnected from everything. And that's what happens when a 20-year-old man learns that his struggle to feel real is itself real, that his condition is understood by others, and that healing might be possible even when it feels impossible to imagine. Ethan Parker had been living as a ghost in his own life, but on that day at Family Feud, he discovered that other people could see him, could understand him, and could affirm his reality even when he couldn't feel it himself.